Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
Kicked off, I'm in that Lipping Lanes end. Yes, it was still in the middle section that it was really getting chock-a-block. And 90 seconds into the game, we hit the crossbar. And so there's a great roar, and then there was a surge. You could, just like a... They came up the field, the ball went into their pen, and as I went to get the ball, you saw the faces against the fence. And people saying to you, Bruce, can you help us? Please, they're killing us. And I'm thinking, well, who? And then when I picked the ball up and I realized that you could see the surge come again, I put the ball down, kicked it up, I turned around and you saw the people getting up to the top into the stands. And a lot of the fans and a lot of people were saying, get down, you silly thing, you can't come up here, we're full. But they didn't realize that they were standing on bodies.
Good afternoon. In the next 30 minutes, we'll be presenting a special report into yesterday's fire at the Bradford City football ground, which has so far claimed 52 lives. Police fear the death toll could go even higher. They say 80 people are unaccounted for, but it's thought that figure includes the 52 killed. Robert Hall reports.
Late this morning, forensic experts were still continuing the painstaking task of literally combing through the ashes of what had been the stand, in the hopes of discovering some clue as to how the fire started. Police have received a number of accounts and theories from those who were there, but as yet they say they're keeping an open mind.
This afternoon, the Sports Minister Neil McFarlane visited Valley Parade to see for himself the extent of the disaster. With him was the Football Association Secretary Ted Croker. After touring the ground, Mr McFarlane spoke to Robert Hall.
Obviously the circumstances of this worst tragedy that we've seen in English football.
We went to Belgrade and we were leading 3-0 at half-time, which it seemed everything was okay. In the garden was rosy. But they came back and got 3 goals and we hung on and qualified, and we were all extremely happy, very, very happy. It was just a lot of young lads celebrating and enjoying what they're good at, playing football, and it was marvellous. And of course we had to stop at Munich airport to refuel, and of course the accident happened. We had three attempts to take off, and the third time we went straight through the perimeter fence, and the tragedy happened. It was a major crash, and then so many people were killed, and it changed the whole thinking of football at Manchester United at that particular time.
And it must have been so traumatic for everybody personally at the time, coming through it afterwards. And you not only lost some fantastic footballers, which everybody understandably talks about, but there must have been some great mates in that team as well. Well,
it was a family. It was a family club. Matt Busby had always been keen that young players, were given an opportunity. He'd instituted the Busby Babes. He played young players when they were 16, 17, and then and it was just a magical thing for them. And there was a lot of feeling round for Manchester United at that particular time. They were the champions. They were pioneers. We were going into Europe.
I can never forget seeing all the bodies. Shocking because of the setting.
The little boy was dipped and he fell down. Of course, one after another, they all came down. Piled up and piled up.
I said, get back everyone, I kept telling them to get back, but it was no good.
You've sent somebody to a game, don't come back, and they're laying dead in the dressing room.
My mind was everywhere. I was thinking about these poor people that had died going to a football game.
I prayed, I said, please God, don't let me die.
It was a grim wintry day, very grey, chilly mist was around the place.
A huge crowd, must have been about 80,000 at the game that day.
The game itself was a typical Old Firm game. We've gone in the dressing room, we can hear all the police cars and ambulances. And then John Gregg came out the physio's room. He says, you better get out just now and get yourself out the road. He says, there's been a terrible accident. And I went through to the dressing room and there was none of the lads in, they'd all gone. And in front of me were 4 black bags. about 6 foot long, and I looked at it, and then the next thing, an ambulance man came in with another one. I went, what's going on? Oh, he says, oh son, this is not for you. You better get out.
The railings must have burst. We all fell forward. That was when I could feel my leg getting broken. And the next thing I knew, a policeman was holding me up and saying this one's still alive.
The city of Liverpool remembers the Heysel disaster. This service marks the 25th anniversary of the tragedy in which 39 people died. Football fans were killed when a wall collapsed amid scenes of violence shortly before Liverpool played Juventus in the European Cup final at Belgium's ageing national stadium.
Today we would like to send a message to the people of Turin and to the wider footballing community that Liverpool acknowledges your loss, that we are sincere and take to heart. We as a city know more than most of football-related tragedy and the scale of human suffering it brings.
The tragedy resulted in all English football clubs being banned from European competition for 5 years.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you subscribe, you will be notified when we release a new video. It could be your firm we make a video about next, so don't miss out and hit the subscribe button. You can find me on Facebook or email me if you have a good story to tell. See you next time.